Welcome to the Blind Zone, where creativity brings its own rewards. And today we have a repeat uh, visitor. He was with me before on the Blind Zone, and we talked about woodworking, and he had some fabulous things to show us. And today he's going to be talking because he is a volunteer naturalist for the state of Indiana, and he has some great things to show. And today I'm just going to be a student. I'm going to sit and I'm going to let him do what he does best, which is teach. So I'm going to welcome Tim in. He's going to say a few opening remarks, and then we're going to get started on our program today. So welcome, Tim.
Denise, thank you. It's good to be back, and I relish the thought of talking a little bit about some of the things I do. I spend a lot of volunteer time out in nature, and so I know Denise. If you didn't watch before, she is my wife's cousin, and not only that, they're best friends. And so I've known Denise for over 40 years. And if I get right into my interest in nature, when I was a young boy growing up, it was in rural Indiana, and my grandparents owned a farm. It was adjacent to our property. So I had a lot of opportunity to spend with them. My grandfather just loved birds. And so I would sit with him and look at bird books and, learn as much as I could about him, the animals and such on the farm. A little bit older, we had a cottage at a lake. And so I had a chance to do a lot around the lake and water, and whether it was fishing or looking for turtles or anything to do with animals and plant life around lakes. Uh, so really a lot of fun stuff. And so fast forward through an engineering career, when I finished that, I had time, and I have an older brother who's a naturalist, and so that inspired me to take a program, and that program teaches volunteers about nature. It's very detailed, and so after I think it was 12 classes, I finished out with a certificate in to be a volunteer naturalist. That allows you. There's so many topics, and so you can kind of pick what interests you. And what I picked and what I've kind of come into is being a trail guide and a nature interpreter. The parks and the preserves around, they need volunteers to help take groups. And so most of what I do is with public groups, whether it's a school group or other public adult groups on weekends and such. And so we go through the preserve and we talk about whatever the topic may be. Usually the group will decide what they want, and I know that ahead of time. Um, and so in my preparation, I have to go out and look at the site. And many of these sites I already know, but I try to go out ahead of time to prepare myself mentally and have an education plan. So I will walk the trail, see what is out there currently, so I know my talking points, and I understand what the trails are. If there's any issues, any problems or safety problems, I talk with the management there. So that's part of my preparation, is just knowing those. I will be sure to have a map, and so I'll grab a local map, like this, and I highlight where I'm going to go. Often I know where I'm going, but I just always have that in my pack so that I have it in case I need it. Something unusual happens. So today, our topic is habitats and communities. It's a pretty broad topic, and I thought that we would go on a virtual tour of the park. And I talked a little bit about preparations, but I need to make sure for myself that I'm good. So I eat, I get hydrated before. These things tend to be anywhere from an hour to 2 hours. So I have my map. I've done my research ahead of time. And so I'm ready to go. I typically wear a vest. Not the one I have on today, and I have a big floppy hat for sun. Today, it's a nice crisp morning. It's very sunny out. And I'll go through some of the things that I get started with. In particular, safety is always first on my mind for me and the group. So I always carry an emergency whistle. It's not a toy, and I tell the kids that this is serious business. That if we have an issue, there are codes that you use for your whistle, and people generally know that around the preserves. And so if you have an emergency, you use that to call people in. I always carry a knife. This is just a simple, what I call a neck knife, not for defense, but if I've had times when kids kind of wander off trail and get in the brambles and got to go cut them out, or you know, yeah, and that's happened.
Or leave them in, either way.
Yeah, well, we won't talk about that. I haven't lost a kid yet. But if I want to cut a sample off of a bush or something like that, so I always have a knife with me. I know where I'm going, but I always also carry a compass. I have a good quality compass. I know how to use it. So I have that available. Of course, I have a phone in my pocket with GPS mapping. So if I have an issue there, I can tell where I am. I also carry a light. This is a high-powered green laser light. I use it for pointing out and showing. It works well in daylight if I want to bring someone's attention to something, but it's also, and I'm not going to shine this into the camera, but it could be used as a signal light if I need that also. So for safety issues, I do that so that I'm safe and that they're safe. That's first order business. Okay, so that's how I get started or prepare. And if we're ready to go, then let's start, and we'll get on our hike for the day. I want to introduce myself. I am Tim, and you can call me Tim. You can call me Mr. Tim. I'll say that you can call me by my last name, but generally they call me Mr. Tim. And I have some rules, and my rules are that I'm the leader. So I'll always be in front. I need you to stay behind me because I know where I'm going. And that way I know where the safety issues might be, and I can get you to where I would like to go for today. We need you to stay on the trail. Don't wander off the trail because there are raspberries, there's thorn bushes, there's poison ivy, there's things that you should not be touching. There's some toxic plants that I don't want you to touch. So that leads me to the next thing. Don't touch anything unless I give it to you. And I'm pretty adamant about that because frequently I'll say don't touch. And as you might imagine, young people at times they take that challenge to say, well, I'll just touch it anyway. So then I'll remind them that they just grab the poison ivy root, and you might want to not rub that hand on your face. So don't touch anything unless I give it to you. And I will try to give you as many samples as I can. My last rule has to do with respect. I need you to respect me as I'm talking. I need you to listen, and I will respect you when you have a question. Others respect each other because questions and answers might be what you're interested in. So it's important that you need to respect me. So Denise, I'll tell you that I've started using that in the last year, and it's very important because I have to go back and invoke that many times to try to draw attention back. But it's pretty useful. I found out that the kids generally are respectful of all that. So those are my rules, and I've done that. You can see in the background, we're at the parking lot, which is generally where we start. And so if we're ready to go, then let's move on.
I'm ready.
Okay. So we're going to move off, and our first destination is a prairie. And I've got grasses here, very typical. This is a little blue stem. And you can think of a prairie. So we're standing in the prairie. It's full sun. There's very few trees, which is very typical. Now, this is not a Kansas prairie or a Wyoming prairie. This is an Indiana prairie. It's about 10 or 15 acres, relatively small. But so our topic is habitat and community. So Denise, what do you think is a habitat?
Well, I just think of it like where the environment in which people live, the type of places, like you said, a prairie is descriptive of something, not like the mountain range and things like that. So I think it's more a place of description. Would that be true?
Well, I like that answer. I like what you said about it's where things live. And I'll just add that people, they can live in a prairie, and people, to the shock of many, we're animals. And so we're a pretty large animal, and we're a mammal. And so I try, and that usually catches young ones off guard, because I'll talk about what's the largest animal that that is here, and they think a deer, which is fine, but we're here and we're animals. So, but I like the answer. Yeah, habitat is where things live, animals, plants, but it's also the inanimate things. It's the soil, and it's the rocks, and it's the water. It's things like that that make up the habitat. So if we compare that then to a community, what is a community? What do you think that is?
Well, now I take that more to be the people involved in that habitat. It's the collective group of people that have congregated in a specific place to make the habitat full.
Yeah, I love that, and that's exactly right. So now I'll just expand that to say where we're standing in this prairie. And again, you can see there's very little trees, if any, because prairies should not have trees in them. Um, so, what do you think? The community, what do you think makes the community? Do you think there are humans here in this prairie compared to other things that make up a community?
Well, I would guess just based on our adaptability skills, I would bet that there are people that live in the prairie because they prefer that to say other terrains. And again, our adaptation, like that of animals, is pretty incredible. So if that's where where you're forced to live or choose to live, you would make accommodations to that, I would think.
Yeah, yeah, good. I like that. So now today, my focus then will be on habitats, and we're going to compare and contrast. We're going to see three different ones. And communities, it's the community of plants and animals that are within that. Um, so grasses, they are part of that plant community. Um, and I've got another example here of another plant. This is common milkweed. So you can see it's ready. Well, it has bursted, so its seeds are about ready to go. Milkweed, it supports insects, specifically monarch butterflies, very critical for their life. So in the prairie, you might find grasses, you might find shrubs, you're going to find goldenrod, other plant types, and animals. You're going to find birds, insects, mammals, which are deer, coyote, fox. They all live in this preserve. And so part of the habitat is wide open space, no trees, full sun, could be some water. There's a wetland here, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. But so here's another example of plant life. And as we move on, we're heading towards the lake. If I find the next piece that I want to show you, we come across this fellow. So this is the butterfly. It's a red spotted purple, very beautiful. It's on a tree that's nearby the lake. So this habitat, prairie, supports them, and the water, they're going to need water. So the lake habitat that we're going to come around, it will support insects also. But we see this little fellow, and then we have one that's related to them. This is a silver spotted skipper. And so you can see it's got a silver spot on its wing. It's a skipper because it skips around as it flies, so it has a different tendency. So here's another insect that is going to live in this border between the prairie habitat, and the lake habitat. So as we move on, then we get to the lake. And so, Denise, what do you think of the lake habitat? How is it different from the prairie habitat?
Well, I would believe that there'd be bugs that would live in the lake that would help feed the fish, and different grasses would grow in the lake rather than just around it. I think whatever's in the lake has to sustain the viability of the plants and animals that reside in the water.
Yes, yes, exactly. So in lake habitat, we're going to find animals, specifically fish, some amphibians. You're going to find insect larvae, et cetera, that must be in the lake, and they're not going to survive outside of the water. Also, there are some plants. There's some water plants, and specifically cattail. There's a lot of cattail in this lake, and we don't like that. It's invasive, but it's not going to live out in the middle of the prairie. So the lake and habitat, it supports a different community of both plants and animals. So to compare that to the prairie, we see different animals and we see different plants. But here's an example. Behind me in my photo is pointing to, we can tell that there's an animal here. There's tracks that it shares in the water. Now it lives on land. It doesn't live in the water, but it makes use of the water for a food source. And if we look at the tracks, I'm holding up the sample tracks of this animal. We can compare it to any tracking material we have, and we find out, there we are, it's a raccoon. And so we know that raccoons, they like to go to the water and they wash their food. In this case, they're looking for freshwater clams. Now, I'm not going to show a photo, but there's broken open clam shells here. So the evidence is that here's a mammal, a land mammal, but it makes use of the lake habitat for its food and its water. So in that case, it shares across two different habitats. I have another image of that just proves that here's another, it shows clearly the front paw print of a raccoon. And so we use that. We know the tracks, and just point out to the group that this animal makes use of various habitats in order to live. Any questions to that point?
No, that's really interesting because I know that all animals have to drink water, and I figured that they would go down there to drink, but to actually utilize it for cleaning their food is really an interesting point. Because I was thinking of, I think it's frogs that are both in the water and out of the water, because I don't think toads are. But that's a really good point that you make, that some are both.
Well, yes, and Denise, you make a great segue. You talk about frogs and toads, salamanders in the same group, and they are amphibians. And amphibian means two life. It's water and land. And so all amphibians, including toads, they start in the water. So their eggs must be laid in the water. Those animals mate in the water, they lay the eggs in the water, and when they come out, they are all larvae of some type, or tadpole, we might call it. And then once they grow up and approach adulthood, they come out of the water, and then they become land animals and through their entire adult life. So they're pretty unique. Two lives, amphibians, and that's a whole nother topic. Just love talking about amphibians. So now we're going to leave the lake habitat, and we're back into a part of the prairie. And as we move along, I'm showing here a raspberry bush. We love raspberries. They are native. They are really important. And in the habitat, we like to also think of providing shelter, food, and water. And that sustains animals then and plants. And so this raspberry, it does two of the three. It provides shelter and it provides food. So rabbits and such, I always ask the kids, what do you think? Do you think a hawk would want to go into this huge mound of raspberries going after a rabbit? No, he won't. And that's exactly right. So this is a great plant. We love it for, again, being native, and it protects the animals around, and hopefully it can withstand the invasives that want to take over. And so that's a segue into my next piece. As we move along the trail, heading towards the forest, here behind me is an image of bush honeysuckle. It's a terribly invasive plant in North America. It looks pretty. This is in the fall. It's got red berries. They look gorgeous. In the spring, they got beautiful white flowers. They smell great, but it's horribly invasive. It wants to take over the world. If we could, we would like to eliminate all of it. But I try to bring this out to the young ones and the adults that if you have honeysuckle on your property, many people plant it because it looks great and it smells great, but it's a horrible plant because the birds transport the seeds and then we have it everywhere. So I try in all my hikes when I come across an invasive species, whether it's plant or animal, I try to educate the group on what that means to us and what it means to the environment. So, excuse me, as we move along.
Can I ask a question about that? So yeah. If most bushes and stuff provide shelter and food, is it just the volume of the honeysuckle that's so dangerous because it can impact or move other things out that would have been better? Or because are the berries on the honeysuckle, are they edible to any of the animals?
That's a great question, Denise. Excuse me. The berries provide absolutely no nutrition to the birds that eat them.
Oh, okay.
So
they are just basically they're basically space fillers then with no true value then.
That's exactly right. Yeah,
okay.
And this particular bush, oh sure, it grows very fast. And so what happens is that it takes the space of native plants like raspberries. It'll overgrow raspberries and it gets very tall. In this park where we walk, there's a stretch along the edge of the forest, and I bet it's 200 feet long. It's solid with honeysuckle that are 15 feet high. And they just don't have the labor. They don't have the manpower to manage it. And so they rely on volunteers like me to come in and when they can and remove it. But yeah, so it takes the water, it shades out native plants that we want, say mayapple or something that might grow in the forest. This will take over. And and it provides no sustenance to the animals. And so that's why it's a bad thing.
Wow. So that's just like when we eat a lot of candy, it's of real no value. It looks really great, but it's not really redeeming to anybody.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so we're moving along the trail. Just show an image. We're at the border of the forest, and here's some grasses. So we're still walking through a little bit of the grassy area, heading towards the forest. And as we're moving along here, we come across this little fellow, and so behind me here is a leopard frog. It's a northern leopard frog. The habitat that they like, we're in this tweener area. There's prairie on our left, there's forest on our right. And so they're just skipping along in this area. So they start in the water. We're walking up to a creek nearby, but they just love this area. It's kind of shaded. And so in the spring or midsummer, they're here by the thousands. As you walk down this trail, these leopard frogs are jumping out everywhere around you. And so that brings on a whole different conversation about amphibians and their land life. So now we get to the forest, and so we just stepped in. We just stepped out of the prairie, full sun, no trees, few shrubs here and there, and now we just stepped into the forest. And your senses now have completely changed. So, what do you see? What do you smell? What do you hear? What do you feel on your feet? So, Denise, what is that experience of you've gone from kind of a brisk day, but it's sunny, and now you come into the shade and everything that comes with the forest. And this image is a canopy. I'm looking straight up at the canopy. So what do you think? What's hitting you as you come into this beautiful forested area?
Well, it gets a lot darker. It gets the temperature drops probably pretty dramatically. The noise level changes by the things that are encapsulated underneath the canopy of leaves. If it's windy, you'll hear the leaves in the trees rustling. And I just think that the sounds would be way different. The temperature, the sunlight would be way different depending on the depth the density of the canopy above you. And I would think that it would be a lot more crowded. It would be the trees would, where the prairie had very, very few trees, this would be, they would be more congregated. And the variety of things that are in there would be vastly to what the prairie offered.
Yeah, I love all that. And I'll just add to that that the smell, now
Oh
you're
yeah, yeah.
inside of, with the leaves, now we have a carpet of leaves.
Hmm.
And you're right. It kind of, the humidity goes up a little bit. So to some people, it feels really close, as in you can kind of feel the humidity and the dampness and that type of thing. You can hear the creek nearby. We're very close to the creek now. We'll talk about that in a minute. So now the habitat. So we know things live in the forest that will not live, especially plants like mayaples and ferns and things that are on the ground all around us. There's no way that they would live in the habitat of a prairie because it's full sun and they would not stand that. Even the animals, the mammals, the insects, um, it's going to be a different community that lives within the forest that just 100 feet away in the prairie that they would not withstand that. So as we move along, now we've entered into the forest, and immediately we see this fellow. And so this guy over my shoulder, if I point the correct way, this is a fox squirrel, and they're all over the place. And I remind the kids or the group that this guy, or ask the question: would he be living? Would he have his nest and such in the prairie? No, he's not going to be in the prairie. We see squirrel nests everywhere in the forest. And so he scampers around as we walk down the trail, and he jumps up on a tree to kind of stay away from us and watches what we're doing. Uh, then, of course, it's fall now, and so here's a little quick shot of the leaves are changing, so we can talk about trees. It's fall, and what does that mean? The leaves are falling, and everything about that. So, we can talk through that as a different subject. We're not going to do that today because we're talking about habitat community. So with the creek, I just love this creek. It's an interesting feature of the park. If we had time, we would stop and we would dip for animals that are in the creek. It's a whole different topic that we teach in the springtime. And we talk about macroinvertebrates, but this creek is one of the best in northern Indiana. The water is excellent quality, and they've proven that by the animals and the plants that live there. So I just love walking along this creek. And I've got 3 different photos here, just different areas of the creek as it borders along the park. So, and the habitat of a creek is moving water compared to a lake. So Denise, what do you think? Would there be different animals and plants that would do better in a creek versus a lake and vice versa?
Well, I would have to say yes. I can't imagine too many fish living in the in the creek because it's moving water. Well, I know the lake is moving as well, but I would think that with the things in the creek, since it moves from one place to another, it would require a different set of circumstances to thrive in that environment, other than being a place that animals can go to drink from it. So, what kind of things are different from the stream to the lake?
Well, and you brought up a good point. So things that, if you think about a stream or a creek or a river, there's movement there, and in high water in the springtime, uh, it will push things, and so the plants have to be very resilient. You might have pond lilies, let's say, or lake lilies that are in still water. Well, they would never survive in a river because they get torn away.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you think of trout, and then bigger rivers in other areas of the country, maybe salmon. They must live in a moving water environment. Now there's lake trout, but say salmon would not survive if they were in a still water lake. So here, clearly, there are things that will thrive in the stream that would not thrive in a still water lake. And to me, it's a water habitat, but there's enough differences that I like to contrast the two as another education point with the group. So as we move along, we're still in the forest, and we just peeked over the edge to look at the creek. And so we come across some trees in the forest. Here is one, just to talk about another invasive. This is the standing dead tree. It's the remnants of an ash tree, if I get pointed here correctly. And what you see are the tracks of the larvae. And the larvae has eaten part of the bark, and that has cut through the living layer of the tree, and the tree's died. And if you remember the emerald ash borer from maybe 10 or 15 years ago, they destroyed nearly all the ash in North America, especially Midwest and Northeast. So this is another talking point about what invasive species can do to our environment when you don't know it. So it's a sad tale, but fortunately in the last few years, and there's actually ash that are returning to this park. So hopefully the ash borer has moved on and we have a better control of that situation. Here's another image. I like to point out this is a fungus. It's a shelf fungus that is growing on a standing dead tree. Another interesting point, kids love to talk about fungus, whether it's on the ground or up in the tree. But and this dude is big. He's probably 12 inches wide. But it's just another talking point. I like to talk about cycle of life, because this tree has lived probably 80 years old when it died. And now this fungus, it now lives off of this dead tree. And so it provides life. The dead tree provides life for something else. And there's other critters, there's insects, bacteria, or whatever that's living on this shelf fungus, and it provides life. So while the tree died, other things live because of that. And that, I'd like to talk about that as cycle of life, because those are the real things that happen in nature. Okay, still moving on through the forest. This particular forest has a wetland area. So it'd be a wetland forest. In some cases, we might call it a forest swamp. But this has got some interesting trails here. The creek a long time ago had a different path, and it actually followed right here. And so once the creek decided to move to a different path, it leaves this, and it's called an oxbow. It's a wonderful place for amphibians. So here's another slightly different water feature. It's a water habitat, but the community of animals that live here, there are no fish here, primarily amphibians and other water insects and things. So it's a water habitat, but it's kind of a third type of water habitat that is in this park. So it's another teaching element to me that, depending on the group and the topic, I'll come down this path so that we can talk specifically about amphibians. In the springtime, you come through here, you cannot hear yourself think because of all the frogs, the toads. There's many different species of frogs, and they're all calling at the same time, and the noise is astounding. As we move along, we're still on the path. Let's see if I got, So here is another path through the forest, and we're still looking at the forest habitat and talking about what kind of plants are here, because still the forest is much different for habitat and community. So before we leave the forest, Denise, do you have any questions?
Well, I really like when you mentioned how the creek moved from one place to another place, and I think water follows the path of least resistance, and it makes its own new way. And you can tell, I think, now correct me if I'm wrong, which I often am, but I think when a creek, the amount of meanderings that it does and cuts in, you can really tell the age of the river creek based on the way it twists and turned and how long it's approximately been there. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. And that's a great point, and that's exactly what's happened here. So if you think a very long time ago, this creek was much larger, it was wider, and it was, I'll say, relatively straight. But as it gets older and the water level goes down, then it finds this kind of very meandering path. And so it's younger than the straight high flow. Then even longer is that as it erodes and you have big loops. So just imagine a big snaky loop as it goes across the land. And as it erodes around these big loop corners, eventually it will erode through the top of one loop to the top of the next loop. And when it cuts through, now the bottom loop becomes stagnant. And so there you can tell. Now, this is a much older water stream because the geology now has changed. And that oxbow is what we call that stagnant area. And that's exactly what that photo was showing. So, yes, I agree. You can look at the remnants of what is there, and it's kind of forensics. It's forest forensics, if you want to call it that, that you can look at something and determine what was here before, and you can imagine what it was at some time previous. Very interesting stuff. I love geology, and we'll talk about that just a little bit more here in a moment. So as we start to exit the forest, we see this fellow here. This is a ebony jewel wing, and it's a damselfly. It looks kind of like a dragonfly. It's about an inch and a half long. They're gorgeous, metallic in color, blues and greens. And then I have another photo of this fellow here. It's really fantastic photo I took a while back. But damselfly is very unique and different from a dragonfly. This guy is standing with his tail up high, and it's called obliquing. So he has an oblique station how he's standing, and the wings are up over the back. Very distinctive. That's how damselflies rest. A dragonfly, in contrast, their tail is down and it's parallel to what they're standing on, and their wings are flat. They are level to what they're standing on. So just by looking at this animal, this insect, you can tell it's a damselfly versus a dragon just in how it's standing. But this little fellow, it's gorgeous. Black wings and a green metallic butter body. They stand out. You can see them quite a ways away. As we move along, we come along this fellow, still on the trail in the forest, and this is a six-spotted tiger beetle. Just a little thing, about a half-inch long, green, bright, metallic, yellow spots along its wing cover. So if you look close enough as you're going through the forest, not only can you see a bird or a squirrel, but if you're looking, you can find tiny insects like this that kind of run your imagination. And then you have to go home and figure out, well, what was that thing? You take a photo, and your curiosity takes you to go find out what that dude was that you just saw. Okay, so now we've reached the end of being in the forest. We've seen different habitats. We've seen a prairie, and we've seen a lake. We've seen a stream. We've seen what I call an oxbow, which is stagnant water that is neither a stream nor a lake. Amphibians will not grow in the lake because the fish will eat their eggs. So in the oxbow, there's no fish, and so the amphibians thrive in the oxbow. So we've seen different habitats. We've talked about different communities and why they are in that particular habitat, and why that habitat will support this group or this community and will not support that community. So hopefully we have inspired some interest in going out to a local preserve, whether it is a park like this is. This park has a stream. It has an escarpment, which we didn't talk too much about, which is a geology feature, the elevation, almost like a cliff. It plays heavily into the park features. There's a marsh that I also volunteer at nearby, and a marsh is a completely different experience. It's a wetlands experience. There's no trees. So hopefully we've inspired some interest for you to go back out. We're back at the parking lot where we started, and want to thank you for coming along on our virtual tour, and want to see if you have any questions about what you saw today.
Well, I think this has been fascinating. And in fact, I think a few months from now, we're going to have you come back and we're going to explore the marsh because I would like to see that in more detail as well. Because some of this, where curiosity does bring its own rewards, a lot of this stuff, I, I hate to say this, but I'm not really an outdoorsy kind of gal. I'll walk to my mailbox and I'll swat the flies that are flying around, but I really always appreciated when you would hear a bird and you'd be able to identify the sound, and so that it just thrills me that you're so knowledgeable and that you can speak into these kids and spark in them an interest so that it they can look around at the world around them and see all the things that are offered, that if they like you just said, it's not just seeing the birds and the squirrels, it's looking down at the small insect, the bright green or the yellow dots, and it's just so what ages basically do you hold the most hope out of that they become inspired because of your talk?
Well, I just really love the group of kids that are in the second grade, the fourth grade. And I say that because, second graders, they still have a pretty decent attention span, and they've learned
Hmm.
enough. Usually they're teachers, and we have some fantastic schools, but they come back 3 times a year. They come in fall, winter, and spring. And so they are starting to learn things. And you always have in any group, we try to keep the group size per volunteer to around 10. So you have one or two that they're up front, they're asking questions, they're smart kids, they have good answers, and they're interested. And then you got the middle group that they're okay, they kind of go along. And then you have the two that are always in the back and they're playing around, not paying attention. But the second graders, they have some interest. The third graders, now they have more interest, they have more education. And I am always astounded, and shouldn't be, that you start talking about, well, what is the habitat? And they nail it. Well, what is the community and how does that? And they nail it. And so when you have that, I know I can drill a little deeper with some of these kids, but not lose the other ones. Fourth
Hmm.
graders,
Hmm.
they're again, they know a little more and they're a little more interested. But after that, the interest and the attention span starts to drop off again. And so I've had some high schoolers. Um, yeah, they're not too interested in that. Kindergartners, that's a tough group for me. Because the attention span and the interest, when you want to talk about escarpment or you want to talk about amphibians, and they really not too interested. So my sweet spot, second grade to fourth grade.
Yeah, I can see how that really is all true because I used to work in a school and after the third grade, it all seemed to fall apart. And I have a 3.5-year-old grandson, and I can keep his attention, but I really have to keep that moving to keep his busy mind engaged. So, is there anything else you want to add? Because this has been super fabulous. And again, in a few months, don't be surprised when you're giving us a tour of the marsh because this is great for me because I do have a curiosity about things and I do really love to learn this stuff. So, is there anything you want to say in conclusion before we wrap this up today? And again, thank you, thank you, thank you for the time you've given us this morning.
Well, you're welcome. Yeah, I would just encourage people to get out, and we talk about with the kids and adults. Myself, I know we watch too many screens, whether the one that we have in our pocket all the time, or when you go home and you sit at night and you watch that big screen. Get out, because there's a hugely fabulous screen, like the photo in back of me. We're back at the parking lot. There's a huge screen here, and it's not electronic, and it's not plugged in. So go to the forest, like Denise, you said earlier. I just love going to the forest on a somewhat breezy day and just listen to the forest talk to you. And it does. It squeaks and
Mm-hmm.
squawks. You can hear the birds. You hear that pileated woodpecker hammering on a tree a mile away. So just get out, get away from the screens, go to the forest, smell the smells, hear the babbling stream,
Mm-hmm.
walk through the prairie, because I'll tell you what, September and even at the marsh. Now, Denise, I'll tell you, I don't have a lot of photos of the marsh, so you got to give me time to get some photos. But fall time, Monarch Festival in September in the marsh, thousands and thousands of monarch butterflies. The goldenrod is in bloom, which is critical to the monarchs. And so you just stand there in the marsh and you hear the wind rustling through the cattails and the plants, and you'll watch the butterflies, the thousands just floating around. It's amazing.
Well, I
It's an
remember when you
experience.
and Kathleen came to visit David and I in Tennessee, and it was the the year of the cicadas when they all came out in mass, and we went to a botanical garden, and you could barely hear yourself think because they were so loud. There were, hundred thousands of them. And so I can imagine when you described going into that area where the frogs and the toads are and that it's so loud. I just flashed back to that because it was. And when you mentioned about the smells, I'm surprised that I didn't bring that up because things that I can hear or things that I can smell or I can feel on my face, all those things are great that and I have to say this, everybody can appreciate all the senses that they have and use, they all come to life when you're out of doors.
Absolutely. Yep. So whether you're just walking a simple trail, even if it's a city park, it's just anything to get around those smells and the quietness, because you listen to a forest that maybe you think, wow, it's really noisy here, but that noise is nothing compared to the automobiles and all the other crap that we listen to throughout the day.
Hmm.
So I would just encourage you to get out and walk a trail somewhere, anywhere.
Well, and one of the things I used to really like was in my home in Tennessee, I would lay in bed at night and I would open the window and I would listen to all the outside insect noises, even at midnight. And I was just, and that's when I wish my curiosity would have figured out what some of those sounds were. So even at my son's house, even he lives about 12 miles from me, and the sounds there are so different than what I have here. Now I've heard coyotes outside my window. That's a little disconcerting, but that's not the point of this. But again, this has been fabulous, and I thank you for taking the time this morning, and I do hope that it sparks the curiosity because curiosity is its own reward. So thank you again, Tim, and we will see you next week on the Blind Zone, where we continue to look at things in our world that bring a curiosity and its own reward.